He didn't change Apple once, rescuing it from near collapse as its invisible operational architect. Then he inherited a grieving empire and tripled it to $3 trillion. This is the true story of Tim Cook. Chapter 1. Roots in Robertsdale. The town of Robertsdale, Alabama didn't ask much of you. It asked that you show up, do the work, keep your complaints more or less to yourself, and be home before dark. That was about it. By the standards of the American South in the early 1960s, those were not unreasonable terms, and most people accepted them without negotiation. Timothy Donald Cook arrived into this arrangement on November 1, 1960, born in Mobile but soon delivered, in the way of ordinary life, to the small Baldwin County town that would shape everything about him, his pace, his precision, his particular brand of quiet that the world would one day mistake for passivity and eventually recognize as something far more purposeful. Robertsdale was not the kind of place that appeared on maps people kept for inspiration. It had a water tower, a few churches, the kind of heat in July that made the air feel like a second shirt, and a population that knew everyone else's business before anyone had finished having it. It was, in the best possible sense, unremarkable. And for a boy like Tim, unremarkable was a perfectly good place to learn what mattered. His father, Donald Cook, worked at a shipyard. This is the kind of detail that sounds simple until you think about what it actually means, which is that his father got up before the sun had committed to rising, drove to a place loud with metal and machinery, and spent his hours in the service of building things that were larger than himself. There is something quietly heroic about that, the way it requires a man to leave himself at the door and give the day his whole body. Tim watched that. Children always watch more than adults assume, storing observations in some internal file that they won't access consciously for years, sometimes decades. His mother, Geraldine, held the house together with the kind of steady competence that homemakers of that era wore as a matter of course. The scheduling, the managing, the emotional weather forecasting required to keep a family running without anyone noticing quite how much effort was being spent. She was in this way an operations genius of her own domain, though no one would have used that word. Together his parents built a household that was not wealthy, not politically connected, and not particularly impressed by pretension. What they offered instead was something more durable, the understanding that work was not a punishment but a framework, that showing up reliably was a form of respect, and that the world would not necessarily come to you simply because you deserved it. These lessons were delivered not through speeches, this was not a family of speechmakers, but through example, repeated daily until they became Tim's native language. He was, by most accounts, a quiet kid, not withdrawn, not troubled, just internally oriented in a way that made adults occasionally check whether he was all right and made other children occasionally wonder what he was thinking. He was thinking quite a lot as it happened. He noticed things. He filed them away. He was the sort of boy who, given a puzzle, would sit with it longer than anyone else in the room, not because he was slow, but because he genuinely wanted to understand why the answer was the answer, not just what it was. That distinction between surface knowledge and structural understanding would become the cornerstone of everything he built later. But in Robertsdale, it just made him the kid who took forever at board games. The South he grew up in was not the South of tourism brochures or nostalgic mythology. It was the South of actual history, still raw with the wounds of the civil rights era, still negotiating the distance between what the law now said and what too many people still felt. Robertsdale was not Birmingham. There were no famous confrontations, no landmarks that made the textbooks. But prejudice does not require landmarks to operate. It lives in the texture of ordinary days, in who sits where, who gets what, who is looked at as a full person and who is not. Tim Cook saw this. It would have been impossible not to see it, growing up where and when he did, and it lodged itself in him with the permanence of something truly formative. He witnessed moments that a child in a more sheltered environment might have had the luxury of not witnessing, the casual arithmetic of inequality, the way certain people were made to feel smaller by systems that had been running so long nobody thought to question them anymore. He would later say, in various ways, that his sense of what was right and wrong, his almost allergic reaction to injustice, came from Alabama. Not despite where he grew up, but because of it. The South gave him something that no business school could have put on a syllabus, a bone-deep conviction that fairness was not optional, that it was the minimum requirement for any enterprise worth being part of. There is something almost paradoxical about this, that a place so marked by inequality produced a person for whom equality became a North Star. But perhaps it isn't paradoxical at all. Perhaps that's exactly how moral conviction works. You see the cost of its absence, and you decide, early and quietly, that you won't be party to it. Tim Cook made that decision without a lot of fanfare. He was not a boy who marched or made speeches. He was a boy who watched and thought and stored what he saw, and slowly became the kind of person who would one day use whatever platform he had to say, plainly and without apology, that decency was not a weakness. For now, though, the platform was Robertsdale. The audience was small. The stakes were, by any objective measure, modest. His days were structured by school and dinner and the rhythms of a working-class household where nobody had the luxury of being precious about anything. He helped when he was needed, he worked when he was asked, and he listened more than he spoke, which in retrospect looks like either wisdom or shyness, and was probably some of both. What the town gave him, finally, was a foundation that didn't crack. Not glamorous, not grand, but absolutely solid. The kind of upbringing that doesn't hand you a map but teaches you how to read the terrain. Tim Cook would spend the rest of his life in rooms where people had far more, had come from far more, had always expected far more, and he would never seem diminished by the comparison. That steadiness, that unshakable sense of who he was and where he came from, was the first great gift of Robertsdale, and he carried it everywhere he went. Chapter 2. The Scholar Emerges. There is a particular kind of student who does not raise their hand to perform. They raise it because they genuinely need the answer confirmed, or because something in the equation doesn't quite resolve, and the itch of it won't leave them alone. Tim Cook was that student. By the time he arrived at Auburn University in the fall of 1978, Cook was not swept up in the social theater that tends to consume the first weeks of college life. While other freshmen were busy locating the best parties and rehearsing versions of themselves they hoped might finally stick, Cook was already leaning into what Auburn had to offer academically, specifically the Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering, a discipline so deliberately practical it might have been designed with him in mind. Industrial engineering is not the most glamorous corner of the academic world. It does not have the romantic cachet of architecture or the cocktail party mystique of neuroscience. What it does have is a relentless obsession with a single organizing question: how do you make systems work better? How do you look at a tangled process, strip away the waste, map the friction points, and rebuild it so that time, materials, and human effort flow with something approaching elegance? For most 18-year-olds, that is an odd thing to find beautiful. For Cook, it was close to instinct. His professors likely noticed quickly that this quiet student from a small Alabama town was not simply working hard, although he certainly was working hard. He was working with a particular kind of rigor, the sort that does not stop at the correct answer but wants to know why the answer is correct, and whether the process that produced it could be made leaner. There is in industrial engineering a concept called optimization, the idea that a system is almost never running at its full potential, and that the gap between current performance and peak performance is always worth investigating. Cook absorbed this not as theory but as something close to a personal philosophy. He graduated in 1982 with a degree in industrial engineering, and what he carried out of Auburn was not just a credential, it was a way of seeing the world. Supply chains, logistics, fulfillment networks, manufacturing pipelines, all of these would look different to Cook than they did to most people. Where others saw operations, he saw something alive with inefficiency and, therefore, with possibility. But a systems thinker with no broader business context is a mechanic without a garage. Cook knew this, or sensed it, which is probably why he set his sights on graduate school. The question was where, and the answer turned out to be Duke University's Fuqua School of Business in Durham, North Carolina, where he would earn his MBA over the next several years, graduating in 1988. Fuqua was and remains a school that takes pride in a particular culture, one that balances competitive rigor with genuine collaboration. The famous Team Fuqua ethos, the idea that your classmates are not your rivals but your resources, suited Cook in ways that a purely cutthroat environment might not have. He was not a person who mistook aggression for intelligence or volume for authority. He was a listener, a synthesizer, someone who could sit in a room full of loudly confident people and quietly identify the three things that actually mattered. The MBA years did something else for Cook. They forced him out of the purely technical and into the human. Engineering school asks you to solve for the system. Business school, at its best, asks you to solve for the people inside the system. Customers, employees, competitors, shareholders, all of them irrational in their own distinctive ways. Cook had to stretch. Strategy, finance, marketing, organizational behavior, these were not the tidy disciplines he had thrived in at Auburn, where a problem either resolved or it didn't. Here, ambiguity was the whole point. Reasonable people could look at the same set of facts and reach legitimately different conclusions. Cook had to learn to sit with that, to make decisions anyway, and to build arguments that could hold up under pressure from people who were just as sharp as he was. There is something worth pausing on here, which is that the 6 years between Auburn and finishing at Duke were not years of early triumph or dramatic discovery. No one was writing profiles of Tim Cook. He was not disrupting anything. He was a young man doing the steady, unglamorous work of building a foundation, and there are probably moments in any such period when the pace of it feels almost absurd. When you are sitting in a business school classroom on a Tuesday afternoon, working through a case study about a company that no longer exists, it is difficult to believe that the room has anything to do with your actual future. But foundations are, by definition, invisible from above. You only see them from below, or in retrospect. What Cook was assembling during these years was not a resume, though the resume was certainly taking shape. He was assembling a lens. The industrial engineer's eye for waste and efficiency, now layered with a business strategist's understanding of markets, organizations, and human incentive. The combination would turn out to be genuinely rare, perhaps more rare than either skill on its own. Plenty of executives understood strategy in the abstract. Far fewer could trace a strategy all the way down into the physical reality of how a product gets made, shipped, warehoused, and delivered to someone's door on time and at a cost that doesn't quietly destroy the margin. Cook would not have used the word rare to describe himself. He was not that kind of person. More likely, he would have said he was still learning, still finding the limits of what he knew. That instinct to treat competence not as a destination but as a process would serve him as well as anything he ever studied. By the time he received his MBA from Duke in 1988 and prepared to step into the professional world, Tim Cook was 27 years old, possessed of 2 rigorous degrees and a mind that had been trained from 2 complementary angles to look at any complex system and ask a very simple question: how do we make this better? It was not a dramatic gift. It wasn't the kind that earns a standing ovation, but it was the kind that, in the right circumstances, quietly changes everything. Chapter 3. Climbing Through Corporate America. There is a peculiar joy in solving a puzzle that no one else can even see clearly enough to describe. Tim Cook discovered this joy early, and it turned out to be career-defining in a way that no guidance counselor could have predicted or charted on a whiteboard. He arrived at IBM in 1982 with his Auburn engineering degree, a Duke MBA still a few years away, and the kind of earnest, organized ambition that corporate America tends to absorb like a sponge. IBM in those years was a colossus. Blue suits, white shirts, a culture so regimented it practically had its own gravitational pull. For someone wired the way Cook was wired, it was less intimidating than it was clarifying. Here was a machine. Here were its inefficiencies. Here was the work. He spent 12 years there, which in the modern tech world sounds almost geological in duration, the kind of tenure that belongs to a different century entirely, because it did. He moved through roles with the quiet persistence of water finding its way downhill, each position revealing a sharper edge of his particular talent. Logistics, fulfillment, the machinery behind the machinery. He eventually became Director of North American Fulfillment, which is one of those titles that sounds important in a vaguely mysterious way at dinner parties and becomes genuinely impressive the moment anyone explains what it actually involves. What it involved was this: knowing at any given moment where everything was. Not in a general sense, precisely. Computers being manufactured, parts being shipped, warehouses being managed, timelines being honored or quietly renegotiated before a crisis could bloom into catastrophe. Cook had a gift for seeing the whole map while simultaneously reading every individual street sign on it, and IBM gave him a canvas large enough to practice that gift at real scale. He was not, by most accounts, the loudest person in any given room. He didn't need to be. There's a certain type of professional who commands meetings through volume and performance, and there's another type who says one sentence that restructures everyone else's thinking. Cook was the second type. He asked questions that made people realize they hadn't thought something through as thoroughly as they believed. He had a way of letting silence do work for him, sitting with a problem long enough that others grew uncomfortable and started talking, which usually meant they started revealing more than they'd planned. If there was frustration in those IBM years, and there must have been some because there always is, it likely lived in the gap between the systems he could optimize and the systems he wasn't given authority to touch. A man who can see inefficiency the way most people see color doesn't enjoy being handed only a corner of the canvas. But he stayed. He learned. He built a reputation that traveled quietly ahead of him, the way good reputations tend to. Then came Intelligent Electronics, a company whose name sounds like it was invented during a brainstorm session that ran long on ambition and short on legal review. Cook joined as a senior executive, and while the company itself would eventually falter and fade into the particular oblivion reserved for technology businesses that almost made it, his time there sharpened something important. He saw what happened when the logistics side of a business was treated as secondary, as the unglamorous cousin of product and marketing. He watched smart people make beautiful things that never reached customers efficiently, or profitably, or at all. It was instructive in the way that a controlled burn is instructive. You learn the shape of the fire by watching it happen at a safe enough distance. From there, Compaq. By the mid-1990s, Compaq was a genuine force in personal computing, a company moving serious hardware at serious volume, which meant the supply chain problems were correspondingly serious in their complexity and their consequences. Cook arrived carrying the accumulated knowledge of everything that had worked and everything that hadn't across a decade and a half of corporate navigation, and he applied it with the kind of focus that his colleagues tended to describe with words like meticulous and relentless and, occasionally, slightly unnerving. He was good at this. He knew he was good at this, and there is something quietly sustaining about being genuinely excellent at your work, something that can carry a person through long stretches of otherwise unremarkable weeks. Not every chapter of a life announces itself with drama. Some chapters are just about showing up and being sharp and waiting without quite knowing you're waiting for the next thing. The next thing was not obvious yet. From the outside, looking at Cook's mid-1990s career, you would have seen a man on a trajectory that was solid, respected, and pointed in the right direction by any conventional measure. Good companies, growing responsibilities, a network of people who trusted his judgment, a body of work that spoke before he had to. There was no crisis, no dramatic fall, no pivot forced by failure, just progress, the steady kind, the kind that doesn't make for exciting storytelling until you realize where it was all leading. What he could not have fully articulated at the time was a particular restlessness, the sense that operational excellence, as satisfying as it was, felt like a tool in search of a more meaningful purpose. He was solving puzzles at companies that were building products he was professionally invested in but not personally galvanized by. There's a difference between doing your job brilliantly and feeling like your job and your purpose are the same thing, and Cook, even if he couldn't name the gap, likely felt it in the margins of his days. He was in his late 30s, experienced without being jaded, disciplined without being rigid, and carrying a very particular set of skills that most people didn't fully understand and even fewer could match. He had spent 15 years learning how the world of technology products actually worked from the inside out, not from the front of a stage, but from the loading docks and the spreadsheets and the midnight calls about components stuck in customs. He was, without knowing it quite yet, exactly the person that a struggling, chaotic, brilliant company on the other side of the country was about to desperately need. But that call hadn't come yet. For now, there was still work to do, and Tim Cook, as always, was doing it. Chapter 4. The Phone Call That Changed Everything. The year was 1998. An Apple computer was, by most reasonable estimates, a beautiful corpse. That sounds harsh, but the numbers didn't lie. The company had lost nearly $1 billion the year before. Its product line was a sprawling, incoherent mess. Dozens of Mac variations with names so confusing that even Apple's own salespeople couldn't keep them straight. Compaq, Dell, and IBM were eating the personal computer market alive, and Silicon Valley's consensus opinion on Apple ranged from probably doomed to definitely doomed, but in a poetic way. Steve Jobs had returned from exile and was trying to save it through sheer force of will, which was admirable, but will alone doesn't fill warehouse shelves or get products to customers. Into this situation walked a phone call. Tim Cook was not looking for a new job. At Compaq, where he'd been running the company's reseller division, he had stability, a clear career path, and the accumulated credibility of nearly 12 years working his way through the serious, grown-up machinery of corporate computing. He was, professionally speaking, quite comfortable. He was also the kind of person who had always made methodical, logical decisions, the type who draws the spreadsheet before he makes the leap. So when the message came through that Steve Jobs wanted to speak with him, Cook listened politely, fully intending to say no. The meeting happened in early 1998. Jobs didn't do extended recruiting courtships. He didn't send a delegation of HR representatives with laminated folders and a slide deck about company culture. He sat down with Cook himself, which was either flattering or slightly terrifying depending on how you looked at it. Jobs had that quality, a kind of gravitational compression in a room, the sense that whatever he was focused on was, for the duration of his focus, the only thing that mattered in the universe. Cook arrived prepared to be unimpressed. This was, after all, a company in genuine peril. The rational checklist of reasons not to take the job was long enough to wallpaper a conference room. Apple's supply chain was, by all accounts, a catastrophe. Inventory piling up like geological sediment, manufacturing scattered across the globe with no coherent logic, costs ballooning while market share shrank. It was exactly the kind of operational disaster that would be fascinating to study from a safe distance and professionally ruinous to actually inherit. But somewhere in that conversation, something shifted. Cook would later describe it in terms that don't fit neatly on a spreadsheet. Within minutes of sitting across from Jobs, he felt a pull he couldn't fully rationalize. Jobs had a way of making the impossible sound not just plausible but inevitable, of casting his vision in such vivid, uncompromising terms that the question stopped being "can this work?" and became "how could it possibly fail?" He talked about Apple not as a struggling company but as a company the world needed to exist. He talked about products that would genuinely change how people lived. He meant every word. Cook walked out of that meeting with his logical brain still running the same calculations as before. The company was a risk. The situation was dire. The sensible move was to stay put, and his gut already decided. He accepted the offer. By his own admission, it was the least analytical decision of his professional life, which, for a man whose professional life was built almost entirely on analysis, says quite a lot. He joined Apple in March 1998 as Senior Vice President of Worldwide Operations, which was in practice a title meaning "please fix this before it kills us." The state of Apple's supply chain when he arrived was the operational equivalent of a garage that had been used as a storage unit for 15 years. Products were being manufactured in far too many places by far too many people under far too little oversight. Inventory sat unsold in warehouses while other products ran out of stock. Lead times stretched on for months. The whole system moved with the glacial pace of something that had never been forced to be fast because no one had ever seriously demanded it be. For someone with Cook's habits of mind, the precision, the intolerance for inefficiency, the belief that complexity should be tamed rather than accommodated, it was both appalling and, in some deeply motivating way, irresistible. There is a particular kind of person who looks at a disaster and sees a puzzle, and Cook was exactly that person. The mess didn't discourage him, it clarified him. He got to work quickly and without fanfare, which would become his signature. No dramatic pronouncements, no all-hands speeches about revolution. He started pulling threads, identifying where the inefficiencies lived, and cutting with surgical patience. Suppliers were consolidated, warehouses were eliminated, manufacturing relationships were restructured with an eye toward both cost and speed. The goal was to get Apple's supply chain so lean and so responsive that inventory, which ties up capital, creates waste, and bets on predictions that are almost always wrong, nearly cease to exist as a problem. The word nearly is doing some work in that sentence. Getting inventory from months to days is not a weekend project. It required renegotiating contracts, building new relationships with manufacturers, creating systems for forecasting and logistics that hadn't existed before, and doing all of it inside a company that was simultaneously being redesigned from the top down by a CEO who had opinions about everything. Working near Steve Jobs was, by all accounts, not a relaxing experience. The man's standards were ferocious and his patience for mediocrity was measured in milliseconds, but Cook, it turned out, didn't need the same creative friction that Jobs thrived on. He had his own form of intensity, quieter, more interior, expressed not in confrontation but in relentless focus. Where Jobs would explode a problem with passion, Cook would disassemble it with method. They were, in some ways, a study in contrasts that happened to produce extraordinary results in combination. By the time Apple released the iMac later that year, in its candy-colored, industry-surprising glory, the product actually reached customers. That sounds like a low bar, but in Apple's recent history it hadn't always been a given. Supply could meet demand. The machine could be built, shipped, and sold at scale without the operational chaos that had plagued the company before. Few people watching Steve Jobs hold that luminous blue computer aloft would have thought to ask who made sure the supply chain could handle the launch. The name on the keynote stage and the name in the operations office were different names. That was fine with Tim Cook. He hadn't taken the job for the spotlight. He had taken it against every logical instinct because something in a room with Steve Jobs had convinced him that this company was going to matter, and he wanted to be part of making sure it could actually deliver on that promise. It was, as leaps of faith go, one of the most consequential in the history of American business. Chapter 5. The Invisible Architect. Picture a warehouse in 1998, somewhere in Apple's supply chain holding roughly 2 months' worth of unsold inventory, computers nobody had bought yet, sitting on shelves slowly becoming obsolete, quietly costing the company money with every passing hour. Now picture Tim Cook walking in, looking at those shelves and feeling something that could only be described as profound personal offense. He didn't yell, he rarely yelled, he just looked, calculated, and began dismantling. When Cook arrived at Apple as Senior Vice President of Worldwide Operations, the company's supply chain was less a chain and more a tangle, a sprawling, expensive, inefficient knot of owned factories, bloated warehouses, and manufacturing relationships that made sense to nobody who examined them closely. Apple was making its own computers in facilities it owned and operated, which sounds noble until you realize that the computer industry moves so fast that owning a factory is roughly equivalent to owning a very expensive anchor. The moment you build the thing, you're stuck making yesterday's version of tomorrow's product. Cook had seen dysfunction before. He'd spent years at IBM threading through complexity, learning that most organizational messes aren't caused by stupidity but by inertia, people doing things the way they'd always been done because nobody had stopped long enough to ask why. He had a gift for stopping, for asking, for listening to the answer with the kind of absolute patience that made people feel simultaneously respected and slightly unnerved. Within his first year, he had Apple out of the factory business, outsourcing manufacturing to partners in Asia, primarily in China through Foxconn and other suppliers, wasn't an entirely new idea in the tech industry, but Cook executed it with a surgical precision that competitors would spend the next decade trying to replicate. He negotiated aggressively, built redundancies into the supply network so no single disruption could cripple production, and established the kind of long-term supplier relationships that turned what might have been transactional arrangements into something closer to genuine interdependence. The inventory numbers were where his genius showed most sharply. When he arrived, Apple was carrying roughly 2 months of inventory, 60 days of product sitting in warehouses, depreciating. Within a year, he had driven that figure towards single digits, days, not months. He had studied Dell's model obsessively and concluded that the ideal amount of inventory was as close to zero as physics and logistics would permit. Every unsold computer was a little bonfire of wasted capital, and Cook was constitutionally allergic to waste. The results were not glamorous. There were no keynote speeches about supply chain rationalization. Nobody in the press wrote breathless articles about inventory turnover ratios. Cook understood this completely and didn't seem to mind. While Steve Jobs prepared to dazzle the world on stage in his black turtleneck, Cook was in conference rooms in Cupertino and on factory floors in Shenzhen, working through logistics matrices that would have put most people to sleep, but which he found, by all accounts, genuinely thrilling. There is a particular personality type that experiences deep satisfaction in systems running cleanly and quietly, every part doing exactly what it should, no friction anywhere. Cook was that personality type, fully and happily realized. When the iMac arrived in 1998 in its bulbous, translucent, improbable glory, people lined up to buy it. This sounds simple. It was not simple. Matching production volume to consumer demand for a product nobody had seen before, ensuring that the right colors were available in the right quantities at the right retailers at the right moment, required a choreography that Cook had quietly made look effortless. The machine worked. It reached people. That was Tim Cook's contribution, invisible as oxygen and just as essential. The iPod raised the stakes considerably. Launching in 2001, it became the hinge on which Apple's entire cultural resurgence swung, the device that transformed the company from a niche computer maker into something closer to a cultural institution. The supply chain demands were punishing. Consumer electronics at that scale meant managing component suppliers across multiple countries, synchronizing manufacturing ramp-ups with marketing campaigns, and anticipating demand surges around holidays with enough accuracy that Apple didn't end up either drowning in unsold units or turning away customers with empty shelves. Cook managed all of it with a calm that his colleagues found simultaneously reassuring and slightly mysterious, as if he were solving arithmetic while everyone else was panicking about calculus. There were moments, of course, when the seams showed, supply constraints hit, component shortages created genuine anxiety. There were quarters where demand outran production, and Cook had to navigate the uncomfortable reality that even a perfect system lives inside an imperfect world. These moments mattered because they revealed something important about him. He didn't pretend the problems away, didn't spin them into victories before they were victories. He acknowledged the gaps, adjusted, and moved forward with the same deliberate focus he brought to everything else. The team around him learned to trust that response, which is perhaps the most important thing a leader's team can learn. Apple's margins during this period told the story in numbers. As Cook tightened the supply chain, reduced waste, and drove operational efficiency throughout the company, Apple's profitability transformed. The same creativity that Jobs was pouring into product design, Cook was pouring into cost structure and logistics, and the combination was devastating to competitors in the best possible sense. Apple made products that people desperately wanted and managed to make them in a way that generated substantial profit on each one. This was not accidental. It was architecture. By the time the iPhone was being developed in the mid-2000s, Cook's operation had become one of the most sophisticated manufacturing and distribution networks in the history of consumer technology. The scale of ambition behind the iPhone, a device that combined a phone, an internet communicator, and a music player into something no one had built before, required exactly the kind of supply chain foundation Cook had spent years constructing. When Jobs walked on stage in January 2007 and held up that first iPhone to a crowd that collectively lost its mind, the device worked because an enormous number of things had gone precisely right before it ever reached his hand. Most of those things had Tim Cook's fingerprints on them. He was never in the spotlight for any of it. He seemed to prefer it that way, not out of false modesty, but because Cook had a genuine, durable understanding of where his value lived. The spotlight was for the product, for the vision, for the moment of connection between Apple's work and the people who loved it. The infrastructure that made all of that possible was his domain, and he tended it with the focused, quiet pride of someone who knows exactly what they're good at and has decided that's enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Chapter 6. Stepping into the Light. There is a version of a meeting that no one talks about afterward because nothing dramatic happened. No one cried, no one raised their voice. The quarterly numbers were reviewed, the risks were cataloged, The next steps were assigned, and people left the room feeling inexplicably steadier than when they walked in. That was the peculiar, underrated power of Tim Cook running a meeting during the years Steve Jobs could not. Between 2004 and 2011, Jobs took 3 medical leaves of absence. The first came quietly, the second raised eyebrows, and by the third, in January 2011, the whole world had its ear pressed to Apple's door. Each time Jobs stepped back, Cook stepped forward, not with a flourish or a press release, but with the quiet inevitability of a tide coming in. He had been preparing, whether he knew it or not, for years. To understand what Cook was stepping into during those intervals, it helps to understand what he was stepping away from. He had built his reputation, and rightly so, on the art of the invisible. His great achievement to that point had been making complexity disappear, collapsing supply chains, eliminating waste, turning the messy business of manufacturing into something that ran like a Swiss watch tucked inside a Japanese bullet train. He was the man behind the curtain, and he had been genuinely, contentedly good at it. But a curtain is not a place to stand forever. The first time Cook served as acting CEO, Apple employees were understandably nervous, not because they doubted Cook's competence. No one who had ever sat across a table from him doubted his competence, but because they were used to a very different kind of leader. Steve Jobs had been a phenomenon, a force of nature wrapped in a black turtleneck. He could be cruel, brilliant, maddening, and electrifying, sometimes within a single sentence. People orbited him the way small objects orbit a large planet, somewhat helplessly, often anxiously, never quite sure what the gravitational field would do next. Cook was not that. Cook arrived at meetings before anyone else. Cook read every briefing document. Cook listened more than he talked, and when he did talk, he was so precise and so unhurried that you found yourself leaning forward slightly, not wanting to miss a word. Where Jobs made you feel like you might be on the edge of something extraordinary or about to be fired, Cook made you feel like the problem in front of you was solvable if you simply worked through it carefully enough. Both things could move a room, it turned out. They just moved it differently. What surprised people, what Cook himself may have found surprising, was how much loyalty that quieter style generated. There is a particular kind of trust that builds not in the bright moments but in the hard ones, and Cook was tested in several of them. In 2009, when supply chain pressures mounted and the world economy was still digging out from the financial crisis, Cook held things steady with a composure that bordered on eerie. He was asked once in that period how he managed not to appear stressed. He reportedly paused, considered the question carefully, and said something to the effect that appearing stressed didn't seem like it would help. It was not a joke, exactly. It was just Tim Cook being Tim Cook, solving the emotional logistics problem the same way he solved every other kind. He also had to navigate Apple's famously intense internal culture, which was not always forgiving of anyone perceived as a placeholder. There were people at Apple who were brilliant, eccentric, and deeply invested in the idea that the company's soul lived specifically inside Steve Jobs. Cook didn't argue with them. He didn't give speeches about his own vision or attempt to redecorate the house while the original owner was away. He ran the operations, honored the culture, protected the pipeline, and showed up every single morning ready to do it again. Over time, even the skeptics had to admit that the company had not drifted, had not stumbled, had not somehow forgotten what it was supposed to be. There were costs, of course. There always are, and they tend to hide in the smaller moments. Cook was known to work extraordinary hours, arriving before sunrise and staying long past dark, which left little room for much else. He had made the choice somewhere along the way to pour himself into the work, and during the acting stints, the work poured back twice as hard. The emotional weight of caring for a company while its founder was seriously ill was not something Cook talked about publicly, but it was there. Jobs was not just a colleague. He was, in some real sense, the person who had called Cook across the country and trusted him with something enormous. Watching him struggle had to be its own particular kind of difficult. What Cook demonstrated across those years of stepping up and stepping back was something that often gets undervalued in the mythology of great companies: durability. Vision gets the headlines, and rightly so. Without vision, there is nothing to execute. But execution without durability collapses the moment the conditions get hard. Cook was the reason Apple's extraordinary ambitions didn't dissolve into chaos every time the man who dreamed them up had to leave the room. That is not a small thing. In the history of technology companies, it is, in fact, a remarkably rare thing. By the time Jobs' third leave began in 2011, something had shifted in how people talked about Cook, inside Apple and beyond it. The conversation had moved past whether he could manage in Jobs' absence and toward something more interesting: what kind of leader he actually was in his own right. Board members who had watched him navigate 3 years of genuine turbulence weren't seeing a capable stand-in anymore. They were seeing a CEO. Cook, for his part, never seemed to be auditioning. He was just working. He was just showing up, solving the problems in front of him, and trusting that doing the job well was its own argument. In a culture obsessed with the theatrical gesture and the grand declaration, there was something almost radical about that approach. A man whose ambition expressed itself entirely through results, who seemed genuinely unbothered by whether the credit attached to his name. He was no longer just the operations man. He was a leader in full, and the world was beginning finally to see it. Chapter 7: The Crown and the Weight. The email went out on a Wednesday. Short, formal, and signed by Steve Jobs himself, a resignation letter that landed in inboxes and then ricocheted across the internet at a speed that felt almost violent. August 24, 2011. Tim Cook was now the chief executive officer of Apple Inc., the most scrutinized technology company on the planet, and the news hit the world with the weight of a cathedral bell. He had been here before, technically. He had run the company during Jobs' medical leaves, kept the trains running, kept Wall Street reasonably calm, but acting CEO has a comforting parenthetical to it. It implies a placeholder, a warm body minding the store. This was different. The parenthetical was gone. The crown, such as it was, had been placed directly on his head, and everyone was watching to see if it fit. It did not immediately appear to fit, according to much of the commentary that followed. The obituaries for Apple as we knew it began almost before Cook had settled into the chair. Analysts fretted. Journalists reached for metaphors. Apple, without Jobs, was compared to Disney without Walt, to the Rolling Stones without Mick, to practically every partnership dissolution in recorded history. One columnist, with the particular confidence that comes from never having built anything, declared that Apple's best days were now behind it. The underlying message, sometimes stated plainly and sometimes dressed up in careful business language, was this: Tim Cook was not Steve Jobs. And that, the thinking went, was a catastrophic problem. To be fair to the critics, they were not entirely wrong about the comparison. Jobs and Cook were not the same person. Jobs was electricity, unpredictable, brilliant, occasionally dangerous, and impossible to look away from. Cook was something else. He was the kind of man who woke up at 4 in the morning not because anxiety dragged him out of bed, but because he genuinely wanted to get ahead of the day. He was measured where Jobs was mercurial, patient where Jobs was demanding, and so consistently composed that some people mistook his stillness for absence. They would learn eventually that stillness and emptiness are not the same thing. Then, 6 weeks after the resignation, Steve Jobs died. October 5, 2011. Tim Cook had known it was coming, had, in some quiet and terrible way, been preparing for it as a possibility ever since those early years watching his mentor's health decline. But knowing something is coming and having it arrive are entirely different experiences, and no amount of anticipation softens the specific weight of loss when it finally lands. Apple's headquarters went quiet in a way that buildings rarely do. Flowers appeared outside the glass doors. The tributes poured in from every corner of the world, from heads of state and from strangers who had simply loved the products, who had felt in the inexplicable way that design can forge connection, that Jobs had made something for them personally. Cook addressed his employees with the same controlled warmth he always carried, but those who knew him well saw something underneath it, not fragility exactly, but grief, real and unperformed. He did not pretend Jobs had merely stepped back. He did not pivot immediately to strategy or product roadmaps or reassuring language about the pipeline. He let the loss be a loss. That in itself was a form of leadership that the critics' scorecards had no column for. What followed was a test of a very specific kind. It was not the test of whether Cook could invent the way Jobs had invented. That question, which framed almost every article written about him in late 2011 and through 2012, was actually the wrong question, a category error dressed up as analysis. The real test was whether Cook could lead Apple as himself, rather than as a disappointing approximation of someone else. And that is a harder thing to do than it sounds, because the pressure to imitate, to perform the ghost of your predecessor, is immense and relentless and comes at you from every direction. He did not imitate. That much became clear early. Where Jobs had ruled through force of personality and a certain theatrical genius for the dramatic reveal, Cook led through trust, through deliberate communication, through the accumulation of small, correct decisions that don't individually make headlines but collectively move mountains. He kept the team together at a moment when the team could easily have fragmented. He maintained the culture of obsessive quality even as the expectation of failure hovered over every product announcement like a weather system that refused to move on. The iPhone 4S launched in October 2011, just a day before Jobs passed away, with Siri as its signature feature, the first major product release of the Cook era, even if it had been built on the previous watch. The phone sold 4 million units in its opening weekend. Critics who had been sharpening their pens found, temporarily, less to write about. The machine kept working. The machine kept selling. The machine, it turned out, had been built by Cook in large part, and it ran the way he had designed it to run, with ruthless, elegant efficiency. But numbers, even impressive ones, could not fully answer the question that hung over everything. Leadership is not just operations. It is direction. It is the willingness to make calls that are not obviously correct, to plant flags on hills that others cannot yet see, to carry people into uncertainty and make them believe that the uncertainty is worth entering. Cook understood this. He had watched Jobs do it for years, and he had his own version of it. Quieter, yes, but no less determined. He was not going to be backed into someone else's definition of what a great CEO looked like. In the months and years that followed, he would prove that. But in those first raw weeks of the fall of 2011, with Jobs barely gone and the world still deciding what to make of him, Cook simply did the thing that had always come most naturally to him. He showed up, he worked, he refused to be rattled by the noise, and there was so much noise. He made the decisions that needed making. He honored the grief without being swallowed by it. The crown was heavy, and he knew it was heavy. He never pretended otherwise, but he wore it, and he kept walking one deliberate step at a time into whatever came next. Chapter 8. Building an Empire Larger Than Ever. Skeptics have a particular gift for being memorably wrong. When Tim Cook took the wheel at Apple in the summer of 2011, the skeptics arrived in force. They came with op-eds and earnings call questions in the kind of knowing tone that sounds authoritative right up until it doesn't. The argument, stripped to its bones, was simple. Apple had been a cult of personality, and the personality was gone. What remained was a very capable operations executive who knew how to count inventory and negotiate with suppliers. Admirable skills, certainly, but not the stuff of legend, not the stuff of $3 trillion. Cook, for his part, did not argue back. That was never really his style. He just got to work. What followed over the next decade plus was one of the most quietly stunning acts of corporate expansion in modern history, quiet being the operative word. Where Steve Jobs had built Apple on the electricity of revelation, the gasp in the audience, the one more thing that detonated across the internet, Cook built it on something less photogenic but no less powerful, relentless, compounding, almost geological growth. Under his leadership, Apple's market capitalization climbed from roughly $350 billion to cross the $3 trillion threshold, becoming the first company in human history to reach that number. Let that settle for a moment. Not the first tech company, the first company, period. Full stop. In all of recorded commerce. That doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen by standing still. One of the earliest and most revealing tests of Cook's independent vision came in the form of a small rectangle strapped to your wrist. The Apple Watch launched in April 2015, and the run-up to its arrival was, by Silicon Valley standards, wonderfully chaotic. There were questions about battery life, questions about whether people even wanted a smartwatch, questions about whether Apple was stretching too far from its lane. The tech press sharpened its knives with the cheerful efficiency of people who genuinely enjoy being proven wrong. Cook pushed forward anyway, and the Apple Watch went on to become the best-selling watch in the world. Not the best-selling smartwatch, the best-selling watch, period, leaving Swiss manufacturers to contemplate their life choices in alpine silence. Then came AirPods, which are worth pausing on because their origin story is almost comedic. Apple removed the headphone jack from the iPhone 7 in 2016, and the internet responded with the kind of concentrated outrage that only the internet can generate. Memes, think pieces, sincere declarations that this was the moment Apple had truly lost its mind. And then something funny happened. People bought AirPods, and then they bought more AirPods, and then they lost one AirPod in a couch cushion and bought replacement AirPods. AirPods became a cultural shorthand, a status symbol, a near ubiquitous piece of human ear furniture that most people couldn't imagine living without. The headphone jack never really came back, and nobody much cared. Apple Pay arrived with less drama but delivered something arguably more significant in the long run: a foothold in financial services. Tap your phone, buy your coffee, move on with your life. It sounds trivial until you look at the transaction volumes, the partnerships, the quiet positioning of Apple inside the daily financial rhythms of hundreds of millions of people. Cook understood that the most durable empires aren't just built on products you hold in your hand. They're built on services that weave themselves into the fabric of how you live. That understanding was the thread running through what became Apple's services business, a category that Cook expanded with an ambition that would have seemed almost absurd to predict back in 2011. Apple Music launched in 2015 and, in the span of a few years, grew into a streaming giant with tens of millions of subscribers. Apple TV Plus arrived in 2019 with a content budget that made Hollywood sit up and pay attention. A technology company, the reasoning went, had no business making prestige television. Apple proceeded to win Academy Awards. The reasoning was politely set aside. Apple Arcade, iCloud subscriptions, the App Store ecosystem, Apple TV channels. The services segment grew and grew until it was generating more annual revenue than most Fortune 500 companies produce in their entirety. Cook had understood something essential. Hardware is where you meet the customer, but services are where you keep them. What makes all of this genuinely remarkable, and what tends to get lost in the avalanche of revenue figures, is the difficulty of the needle Cook was threading. Apple's brand had always rested on a particular promise: that its products were beautiful, purposeful, and worth caring about. That they weren't just devices, they were experiences. The history of technology is littered with companies that expanded aggressively and lost that feeling somewhere in the process, that became bloated and generic and indistinguishable. Cook's singular achievement was scale without dilution. More products, more categories, more revenue streams, and still, when you held an Apple product in your hand, you felt something. That feeling is impossibly hard to maintain, and yet it held. There were stumbles, of course, because there always are. Maps launched and embarrassed. Products were delayed. Prices occasionally tested the upper limits of consumer loyalty in ways that inspired vigorous comment sections. Cook absorbed the criticism, made adjustments where adjustments were needed, and kept moving with the same measured forward momentum that had always characterized him. He was never going to throw a legendary tantrum or storm out of a meeting or make a snap decision that people would mythologize for years. His drama was quieter and more durable, the drama of someone who knows exactly where they're going and has the patience to get there. The number 3 trillion, when Apple finally crossed it, generated enormous headlines in the usual rotation of staggering comparisons. Apple was worth more than this country's GDP, more than these combined companies, more than this entire industry. But the figure that mattered most was a simpler one. At the moment Cook had become CEO, a single Apple share was worth roughly the same as a decent lunch. A decade later, accounting for splits, that same investment had multiplied beyond what most financial models would have predicted with a straight face. The skeptics who had gathered so confidently in 2011 had by this point largely moved on to being confidently wrong about other things. That's the thing about being a skeptic. You never really have to update the software, you just find new targets. Cook, meanwhile, had proven something that doesn't fit neatly on a motivational poster, but is no less true for it. That knowing exactly how to execute, how to build, how to deliver, and how to sustain, done with genuine care and at extraordinary scale, is its own form of vision, and sometimes the most powerful form of all. Chapter 9. The Principled CEO. Sometime around 2014, a Fortune 500 CEO sat down and voluntarily wrote an essay that would reshape his public life forever. He didn't have to. No shareholder demanded it, no crisis forced his hand. No public relations firm cooked up a strategy that ended with full personal disclosure. Tim Cook simply decided that the weight of his own silence had become heavier than whatever risk lay on the other side of honesty, and so he picked up his pen. The essay ran in Bloomberg Businessweek in October of that year. Its opening was almost disarmingly plain. "I'm proud to be gay," Cook wrote, "and I consider being gay among the greatest gifts God has given me." That second sentence stopped a lot of readers cold, not because it was scandalous, but because it was the opposite of scandalous. It was grateful. Here was one of the most powerful men in American business describing his sexuality not as a burden he had learned to carry, but as something he actually cherished. The response was enormous, tender in many quarters and in some corners loudly hostile. Cook took in all of it and returned to work on Monday. What made the moment significant beyond its personal dimensions was the platform he occupied. Apple, by 2014, was not merely a technology company. It had become something closer to a cultural institution, a brand that billions of people held in their literal hands every morning before they were fully awake. When its CEO stood up and said something, people listened. Not just customers, not just investors, but teenagers in small towns across the country who were quietly figuring out who they were and how afraid they needed to be about it. Cook knew this. He had grown up in the American South. He understood viscerally what silence could cost a person, and he had chosen at 53 to stop paying it. His willingness to be honest about his own life fit neatly, though not accidentally, inside a much larger argument he had been making on Apple's behalf for years. That argument, stated plainly, was this: companies do not have to choose between their ethics and their earnings. The premise sounds obvious when you say it aloud. In practice, most of corporate America had spent decades behaving as though the opposite were true, treating social responsibility as a luxury item to be tacked onto the annual report once profits were safely secured. Cook found this thinking not just uninspiring but factually wrong, and he was determined to prove it. Privacy became his most combative arena. In February 2016, the FBI came to Apple with a court order that would have required the company to help unlock the iPhone of one of the San Bernardino shooters. The government framed this as a narrow, specific request. Cook read it differently. Building a tool that could bypass iPhone encryption, he argued in an open letter to customers, would be like creating a master key that, once it existed, could never truly be contained. He called it the software equivalent of cancer. The FBI called his refusal obstruction dressed in principle. The fight was ugly, public, and legally unresolved when the government eventually found its own way into the device. Cook did not celebrate. He simply noted that the argument wasn't over, and it wasn't. What was striking about how Cook waged these battles was the register in which he conducted them. He was never theatrical. He did not pound tables or deliver apocalyptic speeches. He wore his conviction like a well-fitted jacket, calm on the outside, clearly load-bearing underneath. Critics sometimes mistook the composure for coldness, or worse, for corporate posturing dressed up in the language of values. But the positions held. Apple did not build the back door. Apple did not hand over user data wholesale to foreign governments without legal challenge. Apple did not blink when it cost something, and it cost something regularly. The environmental commitments followed the same logic. Cook announced that Apple would become carbon neutral across its entire supply chain by 2030, which was, on its face, an audacious promise for a company whose products are manufactured at extraordinary scale using energy and materials that leave marks on the planet. Apple began transitioning to renewable energy for its own operations and then did something unusual. It started leaning on its suppliers to do the same, making clean energy practices part of the criteria for doing business with the company. The supply chain, which Cook had spent his career perfecting, became an instrument of environmental leverage. He was, characteristically, solving a values problem with an operations solution. None of this came without friction. Foreign governments pushed back against encryption protections and won partial concessions that privacy advocates found troubling. Apple's manufacturing footprint in China drew sustained criticism during periods of labor controversy and geopolitical tension, and Cook navigated those pressures in ways that satisfied almost no one completely. There is an honest accounting in which Cook's Apple was principled and complicated at once, which is perhaps the most accurate thing you can say about any institution that operates at genuine global scale. Moral clarity is easier at smaller sizes. But the through line of Cook's leadership was a refusal to accept the premise that integrity was a strategic handicap. When he came out publicly, he did not do it because a consultant told him the demographics favored it. When he fought the FBI, he did not do it because it was cheap. When he pledged Apple to environmental accountability, he did not do it because it cost nothing. Each of these choices carried real risk, real cost, and in some cases real personal exposure. He made them anyway. There is a version of leadership that treats values as the wrapping paper around decisions made entirely on other grounds. Cook's version was different. He seemed to genuinely believe, in the way that some people believe things so deeply that arguing about it feels slightly beside the point, that the right choice and the smart choice were usually the same choice if you were willing to take the long view. Apple's continued commercial dominance during his tenure did not prove this theory correct by itself, but it made dismissing it a lot harder. The boy who had once sat in church pews in Robertsdale, who had absorbed without being told the moral weight of silence and the cost of saying nothing when something needed to be said, had grown into a man who ran the most valuable company on earth and chose, repeatedly, to say something anyway. For Tim Cook, a quiet life and a principled one were never the same thing. Chapter 10. Legacy in Motion. A pandemic is a strange crucible in which to prove yourself. Most leaders, when the world locked its doors in March of 2020, had the luxury of managing a single crisis at a time. Supply chains buckled, employees vanished into spare bedrooms with laptop cameras aimed at the wrong walls. Consumer demand swung wildly between catastrophic and inexplicable. People were apparently very serious about buying exercise equipment and very unserious about buying dress shoes. Tim Cook managed all of it at once, for a company whose products touched the daily lives of more than 1 billion people, and he did it with the kind of composure that either reflects extraordinary inner calm or the most disciplined performance of ordinary human anxiety in corporate history. Perhaps both. Apple not only survived the pandemic years, it thrived in ways that felt almost unseemly against the backdrop of global suffering. iPhone sales surged as the world discovered that a small glass rectangle was in fact its most essential companion in isolation. Services revenue climbed as people streamed, gamed, and subscribed their way through quarantine. The company crossed $2 trillion in market capitalization in August of 2020, becoming the first American company to do so, and it barely slowed down. From the outside, it looked effortless. From the inside, those who worked under Cook described furious, methodical problem-solving, late nights, and a leader who expected much but remained, somehow, even-keeled through all of it. His colleagues have noted, with something between admiration and mild bewilderment, that Cook appears to operate at roughly the same emotional temperature whether he is announcing record earnings or rerouting a semiconductor supply chain around a geopolitical earthquake. The supply chain crises of the early 2020s were not small tremors. They were the kind of systemic disruptions that engineers and economists had spent years modeling as theoretical worst cases and then watched materialize in real time. Chip shortages strangled the entire technology industry. Shipping containers piled up in ports like a logistical fever dream. Cook, the man who had once compressed Apple's inventory from months into days, now confronted a world in which the parts to build its most important products simply could not be guaranteed to arrive. He navigated it, not without cost, not without constraint, but with the same patient, relentless problem-solving that had defined him since the late 90s. There is something quietly poetic about the idea that the operational genius who built Apple's supply chain into a marvel was then asked to keep it functioning when the entire global system it depended on started pulling itself apart. He did not flinch in public. Whatever was happening internally, the face he showed was deliberate and resolved. Then came the Apple Vision Pro, announced in June of 2023, and with it a concept Cook had been nurturing for years: spatial computing. The headset was expensive, technically extraordinary, and not entirely obvious to a public that had spent decades staring at flat screens. Cook called it the beginning of a new era of computing. Critics called it a lot of things, ranging from genuinely transformative to a very beautiful solution in search of a problem. Both reactions, in their own way, suggested that Apple had done something that mattered. The safe products do not generate that particular combination of awe and argument. Cook has never claimed to be in the business of playing it safe. What makes the later chapters of Cook's tenure feel distinct from the earlier ones is not the scale of the products or the numbers on the balance sheet. It is the increasing sense that he is running something else alongside Apple, a kind of parallel project, quieter and more personal, about what a life at the top of the world is actually supposed to mean. He has given away a substantial portion of his personal wealth, committing to philanthropy with an intentionality that resists the splashier gestures of some of his peers in the billionaire class. He has spoken about the influence of his upbringing, about his mother and father, about the lessons absorbed in a small Alabama town that money cannot renegotiate. He has talked about mortality, not in the dramatic way that grief sometimes compels people toward reflection, but in the steadier, more disciplined way of someone who made a private decision somewhere along the road to hold success loosely. He exercises before the sun comes up, he sleeps, he reads, he tries, in the margins of an existence that is objectively unusual, to remain a person he recognizes. There is something genuinely funny about the fact that Tim Cook, one of the most powerful executives in human history, a man whose decisions move financial markets and reshape industries, is probably best known to a certain generation primarily as the person who is not Steve Jobs. That comparison followed him into the CEO role like an uninvited guest who would not leave. And yet, here is what the years have quietly established. Cook never needed to be Jobs. He needed to be Cook, which turned out to be something rarer and harder to define, and in its own way just as essential. Where Jobs was fire, Cook was structure. Where Jobs was vision, Cook was delivery. And without delivery, vision is just a beautiful dream sitting in a warehouse for 3 months. The boy who grew up in Robertsdale watching his father come home from the shipyard, who sat in the back of classrooms absorbing more than anyone realized, who folded himself into a system at IBM and learned every crease of it before leaving to fold himself into a broken one at Apple. That boy is now in his 60s and still showing up. He still rises before dawn. He still answers emails. He still walks into rooms where enormous decisions are being made and says, in whatever way the moment requires, that Apple is going to try to do this right. His story does not have the narrative shape that biographies usually prefer. There is no single mountain, no climactic scene where everything is won or lost in one stroke of courage. It is something quieter and, in its own way, more durable. A long accumulation of days, each one worked with care, each one building towards something whose full dimensions are still becoming clear. The chapter is not finished. The page is not full. Tim Cook is still writing it, one deliberate morning at a time. If this story surprised you, wait until you see who's next. Subscribe now, because the next biography might completely change how you see history.